Pip. 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 Leolio's calls drifted through the trees as Florine and her entourage made their way through the sparse woodland of the northern Abelian hills. According to the avian demi-human, the calls were normal-an instinctive behavior that communicated the Miku's wariness to the surrounding environment. Others who shared the same environment, namely the Ei and the various animals that were killed or driven away by Yaldabaoth's occupation, all had an instinctive understanding of the Miku's simple vocabulary of calls and reacted accordingly. The periodic call would have probably been fine from a distance, but Leolio was standing on her head. Pip. Pip. How long do you have to pip for? Florine asked. Pip. Everything is new, Pip. Did that mean he would be making that sound the entire time? Once she finished speaking to the Miku, Leolio insisted on coming with her. She initially agreed, thinking that it was a good chance to get to learn more from him. Asking him not to make his calls was like asking a human not to flinch whenever something randomly came flying at their face, so it seemed that her only choice was to bear with it. A strange-looking tree, a squirrel in a bush, a suspicious shadow, it all warranted a pip. We are approaching the perimeter of the orc village, the elder Lich sergeant said. Is it safe to go in? Florine asked. No squatters have been observed, the elder Lich sergeant answered. Squatters? The local demi-humans probably had no concept of a squatter. They lived on the land and fought for territory if they required more. While the powerful might receive tribute, there was nothing like the tenant agreements or rent. An empty village in an unclaimed territory was a ready-made home waiting to be occupied. All they had to do was fight to keep it. Leolio's peeping picked up as they came within view of the abandoned orc village. Since it was just north of her and close to the planned route of the highway, she figured it wouldn't hurt to take a look at how the Ganzu tribe once lived. At first, Florine couldn't find the homes, but then she realized she was staring at their roofs. She stepped around the buildings at the perimeter of the village and walked onto the well-worn lane that wove between them. As the orcs had stated, their homes were made from sod. They weren't the homes that new settlers on the frontier might construct, however. How long did they live here for? Going by where the entrance of the nearest home was, over 2 meters of earth had built up on its original rooftop. Many had trees and shrubs growing out of them. The mounds containing each dwelling were sizable, forming rows together with the other homes that flowed along the contours of the slope. A wide wooden wall made up the front of the house, which came complete with a door and 3 windows. In addition, an odd-looking chimney came out at an angle, which she supposed made sense given how thick the roof now was. Opposite the lane was a garden plot that had become overgrown from lack of care. It looked like a large animal had come in and broken one section of the wooden fence. Were they raising livestock? Or were they growing herbs? She couldn't tell at a glance. Florine turned the handle of the door, finding the interior undisturbed. A layer of dust coated everything, but what she found wouldn't be out of place in a human home. The main living space was divided into a kitchen and a spacious work area, both of which were amply furnished. Pegs for tools, pots, and pans stood uncovered in a lonely row on the wall. In the work area was a wooden loom still partway through weaving some brown cloth. The shelves nearby that probably stored bolts of fabric had been emptied and the simple wooden table beside the loom had a single candle holder caked over with wax. The house had 4 rooms in addition to its main living space. One was what she assumed to be the master bedroom, which was placed at the entrance of a short corridor. Another was thoroughly ransacked, though it looked like many of the former inhabitants' belongings remained. The other 2 had pairs of child-sized beds and a few toys were strewn about the floor. In all, it looked like they had left in a hurry, carrying their most useful things along with them. Going by what she had heard from the orcs in Warden's Vale, many of the villages were overrun by Yaldabaoth's forces before they were warned of his coming. This one looked like it had gotten lucky, or was it lucky to be captured, subjected to all manner of unspeakable tortures, and then eventually rescued? Florine left the home, gently closing the door behind her before continuing her inspection of the village. The next house over had a yard with tanning frames. She passed several more tanners and tailors before coming across a crude smithy. It was half collapsed and dark stains covered the stones of the furnace. Further down the slope, she found a larger lane that led to a large open space. At its center was a raised platform fashioned from timber beams and planks. Thick pillars were arranged in an octagon around it, fitted with holders for sconces. The village square, probably? Florine murmured, I wonder how many people lived here. We estimate roughly 1,000 individuals, Isaraka said. Rather than a village, it was more like a town. Maybe the orcs didn't have a word for a settlement larger than that. Additionally, going by the way things were laid out, the orc village was about 1/4 the area of the Uranthal. How come none of this information was in the materials? She asked. The settlements were deemed unremarkable, Isaraku replied. Our surveyors found nothing of note. It felt quite rude to say so, but, in a way, it was true. Her assessment of the goods hastily left behind marked them as roughly the equivalent of a rural family's winter crafts. From the administration's perspective, that made them nothing of note. It's still a problem, she said. Elaborate, the elder lich raised its clipboard. Compared to the tribes around the Azalisia Mountains, Florine said, they're very advanced. But that nothing of note is going to be a problem in Uranthal. The royal court's domestic policies encourage the Sorceress Kingdom's citizens to pursue the professions they excel in. Nothing of note suggests that there's nothing they excel in. While mostly reasonable in her expectations, Lady Albedo was also very keen on optimizing the citizenry. Having yet another group of demi-humans with no specialization in particular wouldn't please her in the slightest. The racial strengths that allowed the orcs to compete against their neighboring tribes meant little to nothing in a civilian setting. In Uranthal, they were in pretty much the same boat as ogres. No, that wasn't right. Ogres weren't especially bright, so they were perfectly happy just earning enough to eat and maybe buying something interesting or useful once in a while. Orcs, on the other hand, seemed every bit as intelligent as humans. As far as humans went, that usually meant one wouldn't be satisfied with what they had once one grew accustomed to their new environment. Without a racial specialization, however, they were forever hampered by their racial class levels. They had to work harder to achieve the same results as a human artisan, and their cost of living would be higher due to their diet. In all honesty, they would have been more competitive if they had stayed in the Abelian Hills where they only had other demi-humans to contend with. Has the escort come across anything? The area is clear, the elder lich sergeant said. The location of this territory is adjacent to other abandoned or downsized territories. Lady Albedo instructed us to keep these lands unoccupied for the pending construction. I see. That was one way to keep people from complaining about having a highway built through their territory. Not that any human would complain about something like that. High nobles would clamor over one another for such an economic boom. The local tribes probably only saw it as a disruption to hunting and damage to their environment. I've seen enough, she said. Let's move on. I'd like to arrive at the next place before dark. She returned to her solita. Leolio somehow stayed on her head as she mounted. The Mycure refused to sit on the solita as they traveled, but he was perfectly fine sitting on her head while she sat on the solita. The next territory was roughly 50 kilometers to the west, a land once populated by a species of goat beastmen locally known as the Barfolk. Florine idly wondered if all beastmen with the appearance of one particular animal all counted as the same. They followed the river that ran through the village upstream until it ended at a bubbling spring. Her escort led her past it, going over the ridge beyond and entering the next valley. Partway down, they came across a set of grisly markers driven into the slopes. Each one was painted a garish red and adorned with multiple skulls. Strings of bone and feathers held together by coarse twine clattered in the breeze. Florine stared up at the fetish-like objects with wide eyes. Pyap, Leolio cried, the Barfolk lie beyond Pyap. These are the lands of the Grand King of Destruction, Bissa. My notes said that he was the lord of the Barfolk clans, Florine said. Was he actually a king? Was this a Barfolk kingdom? It probably wasn't, but it would have been nice if the local tribes had some familiarity with systems of monarchy. As far as Florine knew, however, Bissa had achieved his position as an absolute ruler through personal merit rather than any hereditary succession. It wouldn't be wrong to call him a warlord. A king, Leolio said, years ago, he unified the Barfolk tribes through his mighty feats. A mighty king who conquered the tribes all around. So basically a warlord. Then again, House Vaisel forged Rias ties through a violent unification after the demon god's rampage. The Baharuth Empire, too, rebelled and maintained its independence through the force of arms. However, she was pretty certain that King Bissa's kingdom would have fallen with him had he and all of his people not been killed in the war with the Holy Kingdom. Any progress he brought his tribes would have likely been erased by the next tyrant as they reshaped the clans in their own image. My materials say that the Barfolk are all gone, Florine said. Can you confirm this? The patrols passing through this area have noted no demi-human activity, the elder Lich Sergeant said. Going by his continued calls, Leolio didn't believe them. Florine rode forward anyway, frowning down at her map. This seems awfully convenient. Every tribe standing in the way between the Great Wall of Roble and the Sorceress Kingdom's planned highway had been destroyed or displaced by Yaldabaoth's activities. The orcs had been convinced to stay in the Sorceress Kingdom, though they had wanted to flee regardless. The trees grew more crowded as they traveled west and had to take several detours to avoid a few small canyons and falls. 2 hours later, Leolio's cries rose sharply in alarm. Florine eased her Solita to a stop. Leolio hopped around wildly on her head, then stopped when a rustling sound came from the bushes all around. What emerged was strangely well within Florine's expectations. Maybe it was because she had met Lord Cocytus and his vassals before. 6 insectoids with glistening dark blue carapaces appeared in a semicircle around them. You have entered the territory of the Xian, one told them with a female voice. We recognize the Sorceress Kingdom's forces, but this formation is unknown to us. I am Baroness Florine Cadia Dale Gagne, a noble of the Sorceress Kingdom. I arrived recently to assist with the administration of the Abelian Wilderness. This is a courtesy call, I suppose. I'd like to get to know the people I'm working with better. The short feelers protruding over their heads waved lightly in the air as she spoke. A courtesy call, is it? The Xian who had spoken first said, very well. You and your escort may enter. We will send messengers ahead to inform our king of your coming. Another king? The last I heard, Florine said, your people had a prince. Yes, Prince BBZ is now our king. He was the only surviving royal, after all. Maybe they used a system of government close enough to the Sorceress Kingdoms to relate to. Unlike the Miku, they appeared to be at ease around both Florine and the undead. The Xian were much shorter than they, crawling along the ground under the brush, so a Death Knight went ahead to clear the way for Florine. Eventually, she was forced to dismount in the rugged terrain. Leolio pipped in warning every time they entered a clearing, each of which appeared to be created by a hole in the ground. 30 minutes later, they found themselves before one that was much larger than the rest. This one should fit your kind, the Xian said. If you don't mind, please leave the undead behind. Florine leaned forward, looking down into the darkness. It was enough for her to fit into, but a Death Knight would probably have problems. The Solita was out of the question. Very well, Florine reached up and gathered Leolio into her arms. Everyone else wait here, please. The Miku grew very still as she carried it into the hole. Ah, the Xian's voice came from ahead of her. If I recall correctly, humans cannot see in the dark. I'm fine, Florine replied. I have an item that confers dark vision. Her nose twitched as the heavy scent of mold and mildew was carried past her on a gust of humid air. As with the underground area of the demi-human quarter in Irantal, the deeper they went, the warmer it got. It was as hot as a sweltering summer day before the tunnels leveled out and started branching into many chambers. Curious Xian poked their heads out as Florine walked by, her boots squishing over the spongy ground. You appear to be unbothered by the underground, the Xian guiding her said. I can't say that I'm completely unbothered, Florine replied, but Irantal, the capital of the Sorceress Kingdom, has an underground area. I've been to the Kingdom of the Mountain Dwarfs, as well, and it's much deeper than this. Is that so? The Holy Kingdom of Roble has no such thing. Well, they do have those things called sewers, but that is, of course, not the same. You've been to the Holy Kingdom? Oh, yes. We Xian were forced to join Yaldabaoth's army. But we only fought because he held our old king hostage. When the king was killed, our people rebelled and joined forces with the Holy Kingdom and the Sorcerer King. The tunnel sloped down again, then curved to the left. Florine had lost her bearings long ago. How does your government work? Florine asked. I hear you refer to your leader as a king, but I'm not sure if that's because we don't have a word for it or not. Very few males are born to our kind, the Xian answered. Those who are become our royalty. BBZ was the last. I still shudder to think of how perilous a situation we were in. All right, nothing like us at all. Rather than their government being a legal construct, it was a biological one. Florian guessed that prince and king probably weren't the actual terms they were using, they were just the closest approximation in her language. Their path turned up again and they emerged into a large chamber lined with Xian. In the center rear was an individual who looked unlike any of the other Xian Florian had seen. Its scrub-like amethyst body had a regal bearing, and it pulsed and wriggled in place as Florian approached. For some reason, it reminded her of Clara. "Welcome," the purple Xian said in a distinctly male voice. "We welcome what are you, exactly?" Florian lowered her head in a curtsy. "My name is Florian Cadia Dale Gonye, a baroness of the Sorceress Kingdom. I've been dispatched by the royal court to assist in the administration of the Abelian wilderness." I see. I am Prince Erm, King BBC of the Xian. We welcome our friend from the Sorceress Kingdom. Our only regret is that you did not call ahead. I would have had something prepared, if so." "For that," Florian said, "you have my most sincere apologies, Your Majesty. I thought it best to get started right away and I wasn't familiar with any of the local customs." "Humu, I see. That is quite diligent of you, Florian Cadia Dale Gonye. Calling me by my title is fine, Your Majesty." "Your title? Which one is that?" "Gonye. Lady Gonye. If not, Florian is fine." "Florian it is, then. In return, you may call me BBZ. I am afraid that it would be improper of me to do so, Your Majesty." The maggot-like body slouched in its seat. "Humph. Well, if you insist. Hey, Boobibi. Did you find that thing yet?" "Just a moment," a voice called from the far corner of the room. "I think I got it." "I did." "Excellent." The Xian King said, "Bring it here." A powerful-looking female Xian scurried over with a golden chalice held up in one claw. "We received a set of these from the humans in Roble during the victory celebrations," King BBZ said. "Apparently, it's a gift appropriate for royalty, but we had no use for such things until now." "One moment." The king twisted in his seat and bit it with startling speed. It was then that Florian realized it wasn't a seat, but a bear. Sucking sounds rose from the throne as the king's body pulsed like a giant leech. "He's not going to spit that into the goblet and offer it to me, is he? Gods, please, no." Florian's mind worked to formulate a suitably polite refusal as King BBZ's body started to bloat. Her eyes went to the goblet. "Wasn't that far too much?" "Here it comes," the king said. "Hold it out." "Yes." Boobibi held out the goblet. King BBC didn't spit out whatever he sucked out of the bear, but something came out of the other end of him. A clear liquid streamed forth, filling the goblet to overflowing. "Ask," the king said, "please serve our human guest over there." Boobibi came over and held the goblet out toward her. She couldn't make human facial expressions and didn't have anything remotely resembling a human mouth, but Florian could almost swear the Xian was offering her brightest smile. Leolio fluttered up to Florian's head as she reached out and took the goblet tentatively. "Your Majesty," she asked, "what is this?" "It's honeydew," King BBC said proudly, "fresh from the royal rear. I thought long and hard about what would best suit a guest from the Sorceress Kingdom and I could think of nothing better." Florian glanced at the Xian lining the walls of the chamber. They were all staring at her. No, they were staring at the cup. Did they want some? Was it really that good? After looking down at the cup for a long moment, Florian closed her eyes and gingerly took a sip. "It's sweet. And it's warm." "No, wait, this is bear, isn't it? Some people say that bears love honey, but can bears become honey?" She looked up at King BBC, who seemed to be waiting expectantly for her opinion. Despite the taste, she still couldn't reconcile with the fact that it had come out of his rear end. "It's very sweet, Your Majesty," Florian smiled. "Oh, I knew you would like it. I didn't know this until we went to the Holy Kingdom, but humans seem to love sweet things." They did, but knowing what the source was would definitely ruin it. Florian held out the goblet. "This is too much for me to finish on my own," she said, "but the Sorceress Kingdom appreciates your gesture of hospitality. We are pleased to know that we have such steadfast allies in the Abelian Hills." Boobibi received the cup and walked off with it. She downed half of the thing in a single round. The other Xian females made incensed noises and went after her. "Allies, King BBC said. His Majesty the Sorcerer King is so strong that one would think he didn't need any allies. There is more to the world than raw might, Florine replied. I, for one, would be most appreciative if your Majesty shared the Xian's knowledge of the region and its workings. In truth, the Xian didn't need much from the Sorceress Kingdom. Since they lived in a colossal hive under the 1,000 sinkholes in the northwest of the Abelian Hills, Lady Albedo decided it was too much of a bother to relocate them. Their neighbors had been destroyed by Yaldabaoth and their lands were left unoccupied, so hunting was plentiful. They were one of the only races in the area that didn't require imports of meat from the Sorceress Kingdom. Florine needed more from them than they did from her, so she feared that they would be the hardest to convince to cooperate. Fortunately, their ruler appeared to be an amicable fellow. I would be pleased to be of assistance, he said. One of my royal stature doesn't travel much overland, but my people have accumulated a vast amount of knowledge over time. For instance, I see you have a Yi Maiku there. Maiku, Leolio peeped sadly. Oh, the king's body deflated slightly. You have my condolences. I'm afraid that I'll only find tragedies in the wake of Yaldabaoth's evil reign, Florine said. I would like to learn as much as I can, in hopes that it will help me find a way forward for all of the survivors. King BBZ wriggled in his seat, looking nothing more than a grub that had been dug up and tossed into the sun. I must ask you one question, though, he said. Why? Why? Indeed, the king said. The Sorceress Kingdom is so powerful that they could force anyone to do anything. Why use these roundabout means? Because force alone achieves little in the long run, Florine said. And, besides, haven't the people already had enough of it? The king remained silent for a dozen heartbeats. His body shimmered in the light of the fungus growing out of the roof and walls as he twisted and turned. You come across differently from the humans in the Holy Kingdom, he said. It is filled with the kindness that is not known in these lands. Kindness and patience. Maybe that's what these lands need, Your Majesty, Florine replied. And weren't you allies with the Holy Kingdom in the fight against Yaldabaoth? Allies and enemies, King BBZ corrected her. And we have been enemies for far longer. Already, I can sense the bonds of camaraderie giving way to old hatreds. I often think to myself, this is what it must have felt like to be one of the heroes of legend. A great crisis brought so many together, yet here we are now. The Sorceress Kingdom won't let that happen, she told him. Unlike any heroes, we are here to stay. 21st day, lower wind month, 1 CE. Florine spent the next few days with the Xian, learning what she could about the Abelian Hills, its people, their relationships, and the region's recent history. For the most part, the venture had proven more fruitful than she had expected, though the Xian did have a variety of blind spots that she believed stemmed from their nature. Foremost amongst these was anything to do with how economics and trade worked between the tribes. As an insectoid race that lived in highly structured hives, the Xian had little in the way of appreciation for those concepts. Insights and observations on culture also had a flavor distinct to their species. As a token of goodwill, King BBZ assigned Boo-Bibi to accompany Florine on her tasks. And, so, another member was added to her party. Do the Xian have any needs particular to their race? Florine asked as they made their way back down the 1,000 sinkholes. Needs? Boo-Bibi said, do you mean food and such? Amongst other things, Florine said. My information on the Xian before coming here was limited to notes on consumption and location. The appearance of your king was a surprise, he looks so different from the rest of you. Florine wasn't sure whether it would be rude to point that out to the king, so she simply smiled and interacted as if nothing was wrong. That is a common question for the few who see our males, Boo-Bibi said. All I can say is that is how things are. It is just as strange to us that your males and females mostly look the same. She supposed that she could accept that. No one questioned why men and women looked the way that they did, after all. As for my needs, Boo-Bibi said, it will be lonely being away from home, but it is not as terrifying as it first seemed when Yaldabaoth forced us to fight for him in the Holy Kingdom. We can eat any sort of meat that can be found in the area. What about rest or any cultural practices? At home, we take many naps. Outdoors, we can be active for days at a time, but our rest is long. Come to think of it, Florine said, I don't think I've seen Leolio ever sleep. Leolio always sleeps, the Maiku atop her head replied. You do? One part of Leolio sleeps while another part is awake. Leolio is always asleep and always awake. Is that so? Well, so long as I'm not somehow abusing you, just let me know if you need to rest. Leolio hopped on her head several times. The Maiku always guard the herd. How can one always guard the herd if one is entirely asleep? This is silly. Where will your journey be taking you? Fubibi asked. Everywhere, Florine answered. But, for now, we're on the way back to the administration's local office before heading out on the next leg. According to the map, we'll be following a river back down and most of the trip will be back through the Barfolk and the Yai-Maiku's former territory. I see, the Xian said. So we'll be traveling down the Longhorn, is it? The Longhorn? It is the name that the Barfolk gave this tributary of the Abelian River. The Shorthorn joins it further down. Under Bissa's leadership, the Barfolk territory expanded to straddle both rivers. She wondered how many names the tribes have for the same features. The notion was bound to be one of many sources of confusion if they didn't keep careful track of everything. According to the administration's map, the new highway was supposed to go through the thinnest part of the neck and across the former Orc and Barfolk territories before running west along the forest south of the Thousand Sinkholes where the Xian lived. From there, it would connect with the fortress city of Kalincha, where the hole in the Great Wall created by Yaldabaoth remained unrepaired. Considering the dire financial state of the Holy Kingdom of Roble, those repairs wouldn't come anytime soon, so the Sorceress Kingdom offered to enact the repairs in exchange for a permanent exclave in the fortress city. On their way back through the Yai-Maiku's former territory, they came across a convoy on its way back from delivering supplies to the tribes further west. Florine eyed the Death Knights shouldering the steel rods attached to the cargo container's frames. So, Leolio, she said, your life with Lia was something like what you're doing right now? Sitting on their heads watching out for potential dangers? Leolio sits on head because human is so skinny, the Maiku replied. Lia have many places to sit. Could they ride on something like the cargo containers? Florine gestured at the steel box. Leolio does not know. How about you try? The Maiku's talons dug into her scalp. It was a good thing that she had damage reduction. Leolio has done no wrong. He gave a distressed peep. Huh? Do not leave Leolio behind. Leolio has worked hard, yes? You have not been eaten, yes? Florine looked up in confusion. Why are you? I just want you to try and see what it's like. I'm not mad at you or anything. Leolio sat down, clearly unwilling to move. Florine sighed. Then how about we get some of your people to come and try? They separated from the convoy, with Leolio guiding them back to his tribe. The sounds of the Maiku calling out their warnings announced their presence far in advance. Though she couldn't see him, Florine felt that Leolio's bearing grew more proud the closer they got to his home. Or is it his home? Leolio, Florine asked, why did your people end up gathering here? It is the place of meetings, Leolio said. Where Maiku without Liai and Liai without Maiku come together. The Liai are gone, but we do not know where else to go. How long did two races have to live together for them to not know what to do without one another? Florine regarded the thousands of Maiku staring at her from the shadows of the hidden hilltop grove. Isoroku, she said, could you have the Ministry of Transportation dispatch an empty convoy to our location? Have our army liaison come along, as well. The elder lich raised a bony hand to its head. Florine produced the binder of racial dossiers from her infinite haversack, flipping it open to the profiling of the Maiku. A sense of anger rose within her when she found no mention of the Liai, but there was nothing to be gained from being angry. Will this work? I suppose we won't know until we try. Florine dismounted, walking up to the edge of the grove. The assembled Maiku eyed her warily and kept their distance, but they didn't flee. Why have you returned, human lair? A voice sounded from the crowd. I've just returned from visiting with the Xian, Florine replied. The work that I spoke of, I've given it some thought and I'd like to try something out. If the Maiku's way of life consisted of riding things around and keeping an eye on the surroundings, then maybe they could ride the convoys around. If they could manage that, then the next step would be adding them to the area's security patrols. Being around Ludmilla as much as she did, Florine was well aware of the need for rangers in the Royal Army. The Maiku seemed naturally suited for the role, providing unsleeping sentries for the unsleeping undead patrols. That was her hope, at least. It would be nice if it worked in practice. With the convoy likely several hours away, Florine took out a chair and a small table out of her infinite haversack, sitting down to check over the notes she had taken while in the company of the Xian. "Please rest while you can," Florine told Boobibi. "We have some time before we need to get going again." "Then, if you'll pardon me." Florine frowned as Boobibi scooted under her table. She was larger than King BBZ, but that wasn't saying much considering he was just under a meter long. "Am I being improper?" Boobibi said. "I'm more comfortable with something solid over my head. I don't know anyone that prefers to sleep under tables, but if it's all right with you." She glanced down at the insectoid, who had fit her head and shoulders under the table. Her eyes were drawn to her left shoulder, where her shiny midnight blue carapace sheathing her eel-like upper body was shattered and split apart, revealing the flesh beneath. Boobibi tended to move with respect to the injury, wincing painfully whenever she didn't. "If you don't mind my asking," Florine said, "how did that happen?" Yaldabaoth. Boobibi's tone was filled with resentment. "Back before his forces spread out over the Holy Kingdom, he made a point to have the representatives of each race in his army gather regularly. There was little point in his doing so beyond displaying the power he had over us. One time, a member of my group of races, those that initially resisted him, was late. By his reasoning, this made all of us late. To show his displeasure, he punished one of our group and I happened to be the closest at hand." Florine's lips pressed into a thin line. It was a horrible way to manage people, though she was certain that Yaldabaoth had done so on purpose. It was a method utilized by those who relied on fear to maintain order, manipulating groups of people to police themselves according to their tormentors' rules. Some even had the gall to call it collective responsibility in a perverted attempt to make it sound virtuous. "It can't be healed?" That wasn't the end. The Xian shifted on the ground. "After we were dismissed, I went to see if someone could heal my wounds, but Yaldabaoth's minions found me first. They dragged me away and chained me to a wall, then twisted jagged chunks of broken armor into splints to hold my wound open. Everyone was warned not to assist me, and I healed in a way that left my arm practically useless." Boobibi's clawed hand went to her shoulder. The bitterness in her voice increased tenfold. "Yaldabaoth lives up to his epithet, truly," she said. "A fiend who stands above all fiends. Toward the end of the war, I heard some humans that had come from the south exclaim over the loss of life and destruction that was wrought, but that is the least of what Yaldabaoth did. Mere death and destruction were far from enough to satisfy him. Everything he did was done to taint the soul. Once, I was considered a hero of my race. Now, I am merely a cripple. My king tries to find things for me to do, but his pity ultimately wounds me more." "Are you saying that he sent his minions out on purpose to do that to make your wounds permanent?" "Of that, I have no doubt. He attacked one's pride and sense of worth. Values and morals are mocked and denied. One could only pity our enemies at the time, those paladins in the Holy Kingdom. They were sworn to protect their people and guide them, yet everything Yaldabaoth did tempted them to forsake their oaths. If they did, then it was his win and he continued to break them from there. If they remained steadfast, then their people suffered and died. No matter who they were, everyone danced in the palm of Yaldabaoth's hand, and he delighted in our moral and physical ruin." It was as if the most embellished and fantastical tales of fiends had come to life. Of the demons who reveled in destruction and the devils who brought about the downfall of mortals through their inhuman machinations. There were more than a few fiends in the Sorcerer King's service, and Florine could only thank the gods that they weren't anywhere near as bad as Yaldabaoth. "Does that mean every race in the Abelian Hills was manipulated and scarred by Yaldabaoth in some way?" "I don't doubt it," Boobibi replied. "He had as many ways to twist people as there were races, if not more. Even those who willingly fought for Yaldabaoth to sate their bloodlust and desire for glory were used until there were no more to be used. For some reason, I do not think he cared about those ones as much as he did those that resisted, like the orcs and the Xian. Because there was less sport in it." Florine's voice was grim. "That is likely." It looked like she had her work cut out for her. A land filled with scarred and broken people waited for her attention, and she barely knew where to start. At this point, she couldn't blame the administration for keeping everything at arm's length. The elder liches who only dealt in forms and numbers were eminently unqualified to deal with the mountain of issues that awaited them. They probably didn't even care. A few hours later, the calls of the Maiku informed her of the approaching convoy. Booby stirred from her sleep as Florian put her things away. The leading set of Death Knights entered the range of her dark vision, roughly 20 meters, leading a procession of 5 half-sized cargo containers. The vampire bride came forward to inspect them while the army liaison came to join Florian. Florian turned to address the Mycu. "The Sorceress Kingdom has a need for good sentries," she said. "Leolio did an excellent job while accompanying me, so I'd like to see if other Mycu can do just as well with our convoys. If things go well, we may even be able to have you join the patrols securing the peace of the realm." A great clamor rose as thousands of Mycu discussed her proposal. The army liaison turned to her. "The Royal Army was not informed of this," it said. "Is potentially having thousands of rangers who can keep up with the activities of the undead at odds with the Royal Army's objectives?" Florian asked. The Elder Lich looked out into the night at the wall of noise. "Are you certain that they are rangers?" "I'll leave that for the experts to determine," Florian replied. "Leolio on my head here was very attentive throughout my journey to the 1,000 sinkholes and back." Scratching sounds joined the voices of the Mycu as the liaison took notes. "This one shall confer with its superior," it said before raising a hand to its temple. There weren't any problems, as far as she could discern. Lady Albedo wanted productive citizens, the Royal Army needed rangers, and co-opting the Mycu into something that they were good at was in line with national policies set by the Sorcerer King himself. All they needed to do was figure out the details. "Your proposal has been granted provisional approval," the Elder Lich said after a moment. "How shall we proceed?" "The Mycu seem to naturally perch on traveling individuals," Florian said, "but sitting on a Death Knight might be too much to start with. We'll be having them do their thing atop the containers instead. Our first task is to familiarize the undead with the Mycu's vocabulary." "Vocabulary?" "They have different calls for different scenarios. Leolio can go through them with you, at least once things quiet down." Once the noise from the grove settled, 20 Mycu ran out to cluster in front of Florian, turning their beaks up at her attentively. They all had the same, earthy pattern to their feathers as Leolio, and Florian wondered how she would ever be able to tell them apart. "Thank you for agreeing to cooperate," Florian smiled. "I understand that most people would normally have reservations about working with the undead, so you are all very brave to come forward. For now, all I'd like for you to do is pick one of those metal containers to ride on. I'm sure you've seen them being carried around." The Mycu eyed the Death Knights and the containers they were shouldering. After several moments, one quickly stepped forward, followed by the rest. It happened so quickly that they may as well have all moved at once. They fluttered up on their short wings and settled atop one of the containers. "Spread yourselves out between them, please," Florian said. "This convoy stays together during the journey, so you won't be separated from one another." It took several minutes for the Mycu to sort themselves out. They hopped about, inspecting their experimental perches. The metallic surface didn't look very comfortable. Florian wondered if better seating could be arranged. "How is it?" she asked. A mess of replies came back. Did they always talk all at once? It didn't sound like there were any immediate problems, however, so she looked up at Leolio. "Leolio," Florian said, "can you go through all of your calls with the Elder Lich here?" The Elder Lich stared at her. Now that they were doing it, Florian had no idea how they would be able to document the sound. "On second thought," she said, "let's go through the calls with the Death Knights." Florian walked up the line of the containers, stopping in front of the one in the center of the convoy. The Death Knights shifted slightly as they turned their attention to her. "How should we do this?" Florian tapped her chin. "Let's start with caution." Leolio let out a pip. The Mycu perched on the containers echoed his call, as did the ones watching from the grove. The army liaison raised a pen to its clipboard, then stopped. Florian offered it an apologetic look. "I'm sorry," she said. "I have no idea how to describe that." The Elder Lich wrote something down anyway. Florian resisted the urge to grab its clipboard to see what it was. "You'll hear this one a lot, at first," she told the Death Knights. "The caution indicated by this call comes from their unfamiliarity with new surroundings or individuals. Leolio did this for my entire trip up until the point that we returned to his race's territory. Hopefully, this means that they'll stop doing it once they familiarize themselves with their roots." She looked up at Leolio. The Mycu bobbed his black-plumed head in the approximation of a nod. They seem to pick up on others' mannerisms quickly. All right, can you do the next one up? Leolio pipped again. The call matched the one he had made when they entered the 1,000 sinkholes. What does that one mean? Florine asked. We are being watched, Leolio said. By one of unknown identity or intent. The liaison's pen scratched over its clipboard again. When it stopped, Florine asked for the next call, which wasn't the one she expected. What's this one for? We are being stalked, Leolio replied. Florine supposed that very few would willingly stalk an infantry squad of Death Series servitors. What predators that remained in the area probably fled as soon as they caught wind of them. After the next call, which was the one Leolio had made just before the Xian appeared before them, Florine nodded to herself. 4 calls would be very simple to keep track of and pay attention to, especially considering the single-minded tendencies of the undead. Are there any other calls that you use? She asked. Hunting calls, Leolio answered. The crimson gazes of the Death Knights seemed to flare in unison. Hunting calls? Florine said. Competitors that must be driven away, Leolio said. Enemies that must be trampled and destroyed. The Miku will chase and mark them. It is dangerous, but it must be done. Well, let's hear it. Just for reference. Florine felt Leolio shift on her head. He let out a piercing cry. She let out a shriek and ducked as the Miku on the containers dove at her. The vampire bride threw herself on top of her and Leolio let out a startled squawk as he was dislodged from his perch. When Florine uncovered her head and looked up again, the Miku had returned to their containers. Leolio stood on the ground nearby, eyeing her dubiously. A lord would not do that, human liar, he said. Pretty much every noble she knew would have done that. Except for Ludmilla. She would have probably snatched a Miku out of the air and twisted off its head. You need to understand that not every lord is the warrior sort, Florine told Leolio. This is true, Leolio said. Are human lords magic casters? Several lines from fundamental principles of magocratic governance floated through her head. She waved them away. I'm not one of those, either. I'm just a regular noble, a civilian lord. We do other sorts of things. Leolio didn't look like he believed her. Florine took the vampire bride's proffered hand, getting up and brushing herself off. Let's get going, Florine said. I have a lot of work to do back at the base. It was close to midnight by the time they returned to the Dale of Defiance. Florine found Lady Shiltir filing her nails while waiting for a shipment of food to finish arriving via gate. That's quite the noisy entrance, her liege said. Good evening, Lady Shiltir. Florine lowered her head in a curtsy. We're just trying something with the Miku here. They should quiet down once they get used to their new surroundings. Couldn't you have tried something with sexier subjects? Lady Shiltir asked. I'm into all sorts of things but these don't tickle any fancy. I must work with what I have, my lady, Florine replied. Oh, by the way, this is Bubibi. King Bibisi of the Xian assigned her to accompany me as a local expert. Bubibi, this is Lady Shiltir Bloodfallen, the Minister of Transportation of the Sorceress Kingdom and my liege. Bubibi bent her body slightly, then winced in pain. Florine cringed and looked to Lady Shiltir. My lady, is there something you can do about her injury? Florine asked. She'll be accompanying me while I go around and it would help if she could move unimpeded. The Xian hero looked back and forth between Florine and Lady Shiltir, evidently confused by Florine's request. I could, Lady Shiltir answered, but it will hurt. Nothing pains me more than being unable to fight to my fullest, Lady Shiltir, Bubibi said in a clear voice. Oh, good answer, Lady Shiltir said. Not even the slightest hesitation. That's much better than I've heard from certain humans. Something warm splattered against Florine's face. She flinched, and, by the time she looked for whatever hit her, Bubibi was collapsing to the ground. The entire left side of her torso was missing. Ichor and organs spilled out onto the grass and she spasmed repeatedly after falling into a pool of her own gore. A gasp escaped Florine's lips. Leolio's panicked cries filled the darkness. Regeneration. The glow of healing magic washed over Bubibi's twitching form. Lady Shiltir licked the yellow-green ichor on her fingers. Ick, she made a face. Scratch insectoids off of the list. My lady, Florine swallowed, is she going to be all right? She has way more hit points than most. This may take a while. You should clean that stuff off of you, by the way. I was thinking that I could lick it off of you before I hit her, but after having a taste. Florine used a trooper's towel to clean herself up. When her attention returned to Lady Shaltia, her liege had a wine glass cupped in her palm. A vampire bride carefully poured a crimson liquid into it. Once it was filled, Lady Shaltia came over, taking Florine's arm and leaning against her as they watched Boobibi slowly reconstitute. While she may have not tasted great, Lady Shaltia said, "This is somewhat entertaining. Do you think she'll start screaming when her chest finally closes?" "I wouldn't know, my lady." She wasn't sure if it was because Lady Shaltia had wondered aloud, but Boobibi didn't scream. Several minutes after she was struck down, the Zin hero rose to her feet. "It's healed?" She tested her shoulder gingerly, then raised her arm with a wonder-filled voice. "It's healed. Thank you, Lady Shaltia. Thank you so much." "Don't thank me," Lady Shaltia yawned. "If Florine hadn't asked, I wouldn't have given you a second glance. Anyway, it looks like the shipment's done. I'll be returning to Eranthal, now. Have a good night, my lady." Florine lowered her head. "Thank you for fulfilling my request." MHM. Once Lady Shaltia's gate closed behind her, Florine had the Miku hop over to a set of loaded containers. After she saw the convoy off, she returned to the administration's tent in what she now realized was probably a wide, shallow crater. "Thank you for asking to have my arm restored, Lady Gunye," Boobibi said as Florine unloaded her notes onto the table. "You're welcome," Florine said. "Honestly, I think it was just as much for myself as it was for you. I couldn't stand seeing you like that. You said that the pity of others wounds you, so I hope you'll forgive me for it."